March 1967, Nui Dat Base, Puak Tui Province. Captain Mike Walsh of the United States 9th Medical Battalion stared in absolute disbelief at the Australian Special Air Service trooper standing before him. The soldier had just returned from a grueling 2-week patrol deep inside War Zone D, one of the most hostile and unforgiving stretches of dense canopy in South Vietnam. There was no Hollywood glory here. His standard-issue uniform was severely torn, stiff with dried mud and sweat, while his face remained gaunt from chronic sleep deprivation. The trooper's primary weapon bore the unmistakable, ugly scoring of intense firefight use, reflecting the brutal friction of close-quarters combat. But what made Walsh do a sudden double-take was not the man's physical exhaustion or his battered equipment. It was the stark reality of his feet. They were entirely bare, exposed to the elements. In a jungle notorious for venomous snakes, bloodthirsty leeches, and the constant threat of septic infection, this site completely defied every protocol of standard military doctrine Walsh had studied. "Where the hell are your boots, soldier?" Walsh demanded immediately, momentarily forgetting he was addressing an Allied force member and not one of his own American infantrymen. The Australian trooper, identified as Jim Davies of 3 Squadron SAS, slowly looked down at his own feet, as if noticing their existence for the very first time. They were heavily calloused, deeply tanned, and as dark as thick leather, with spread toes that seemed to naturally grip the uneven earth with independent strength and remarkable organic precision. "Didn't need them, mate," Davies replied matter-of-factly, devoid of any arrogant bravado. "Better grip, quieter, don't get trench foot like you Yanks." Walsh had witnessed plenty of horrifying and strange anomalies during his deployment in Vietnam, but Allied soldiers deliberately operating barefoot in combat territory was unprecedented. It directly contradicted everything he had thoroughly learned in medical school and advanced military triage training. Operating without footwear among hidden punji stakes and jagged rocks seemed like pure suicide, an absolutely insane tactical decision in an unforgiving environment. Yet, this apparent insanity was something Walsh would soon discover to be far more operationally effective than anything the conventional American forces were currently implementing. When American military medical personnel first encountered these Australian and New Zealand soldiers systematically operating barefoot in the dark Vietnamese jungle, their initial reaction was uniform shock. This disbelief was immediately followed by the absolute certainty that they were witnessing either a dangerous case of reckless battlefield bravado or a regression into colonial-era primitivism that had no place in modern warfare. The rigid American tactical doctrine left zero room for such dangerous anomalies. United States Army Field Manual 2110 was explicitly clear and highly detailed regarding foot care in hostile tropical environments. Standard operating procedure dictated that soldiers were to keep their feet dry, change socks frequently during operations, and under no circumstances remove their issued combat boots in hostile territory. The official manual did not even briefly contemplate the absurd possibility that any sane infantryman would willingly go into the humid jungle without proper, heavy footwear. My first thought was that these guys had somehow lost their critical equipment during an ambush, recalled Captain Robert Jensen, a United States Army surgeon attached to the 1st Infantry Division, who treated Australian combat casualties at Bien Hoa in 1966. Then I slowly realized they had deliberately taken their heavy boots off on purpose. I actually asked one of their commanding officers if this was some kind of severe disciplinary punishment detail. The officer just looked at me and genuinely laughed at the question. The entire American military medical establishment heavily viewed properly maintained jungle boots as an absolutely essential piece of modern survival equipment. The highly engineered jungle boots officially introduced in 1965 featured advanced ventilated uppers, specialized drainage eyelets, and reinforced soles specifically designed to prevent debilitating tropical foot diseases. The United States military had confidently invested millions of dollars into developing these advanced boots, basing their design directly on hard medical lessons learned from the Pacific Theater in World War II and various combat operations across Central America. The radical idea that professional soldiers would voluntarily discard this expensive, highly engineered protection seemed to wildly contradict several decades of established military medical wisdom and logistical planning. The American doctrine fundamentally believed that superior technology and standardized equipment could adequately shield troops from the natural friction of the environment. Choosing to abandon these modern protections in favor of naked flesh scraping against jagged rocks and decaying vegetation seemed incredibly primitive, breaking every rule of risk management taught to officers and field medics prior to deployment. We were thoroughly taught that lower extremity injuries were consistently among the most common causes of significant casualties in jungle warfare, explained Major William Bradford, the chief medical officer serving with the 173rd Airborne Brigade. Severe trench foot, debilitating immersion foot, and aggressive tropical ulcers were never treated as minor inconveniences. These conditions could easily take a well-trained soldier entirely out of combat action for several consecutive weeks. And here were the Australians casually walking around barefoot like it was a relaxing day at the beach. Initial American intelligence and medical assessments stubbornly suggested the Australian practice simply reflected logistical desperation. Some commanders assumed that Australian supply chains desperately lacked the capacity to provide adequate combat boots for their frontline troops. Alternatively, they blamed cultural differences, deeply rooted in Australia's rugged frontier heritage, assuming an inherent lack of discipline. Some American officers openly theorized that these Australians, originating from a hot and arid continent, simply lacked the tactical awareness to understand specialized jungle hazards the exact way highly trained American conventional forces did. I honestly figured they would eventually learn the hard way, freely admitted Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison, a seasoned officer serving with the 25th Infantry Division. I fully expected to see their broken units hobbling back into our secure aid stations within a matter of weeks, presenting with feet completely full of severe fungal infections and gangrene. Anticipating a massive medical disaster, cautious American field medics actively prepared for a sudden influx of Australian patients suffering from entirely preventable foot injuries caused by their perceived lack of tactical discipline. They quickly stockpiled massive reserves of extra antibiotics, strong antifungal medications, and clean bandages at forward operating bases. Routine medical briefings constantly warned American personnel to expect treating stubborn Allied forces who were improperly equipped and poorly prepared for brutal jungle conditions. Yet, veteran Australian and New Zealand medical officers consistently maintained that going barefoot was absolutely not an act of blind recklessness or poor discipline. It was, in fact, a highly calculated battlefield innovation, forged in blood and based entirely on hard-won counterinsurgency combat experience. The Americans looked at us like we were completely mad, recalled Captain Bruce Davies, a dedicated medical officer serving with the 6th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment. They would loudly quote their official field manuals at us and proudly show us medical statistics from World War II. But we had our own grim statistics gathered from years of bleeding in Malaya and Borneo. We objectively knew exactly what worked on the ground, regardless of what some clean textbook printed back in Washington confidently told us we should do. The Australians patiently pointed out that their combat soldiers were not universally barefoot across the entire theater. It was a highly deliberate tactical choice, made exclusively by specific specialized units operating under very particular, demanding circumstances. Elite reconnaissance patrols, silent ambush teams, and indigenous trackers often willingly went without boots to gain a crucial stealth advantage. Regular infantry elements still strictly maintained standard protective footwear unless immediate operational conditions heavily warranted otherwise. It was a situational, thoroughly calculated decision that the doctrine-bound Americans simply did not yet fully grasp. The deeply ingrained American perception that the Australians were inherently primitive completely missed a crucial historical context that defined their unique tactical evolution. What the American medical personnel did not initially grasp was that the battle-hardened Australians were absolutely not arbitrarily abandoning their physical protection out of sheer ignorance or indiscipline. Instead, they were deliberately choosing a completely different, highly specialized form of protection perfectly suited for the environment. While conventional American soldiers constantly struggled with chronic, debilitating foot problems despite wearing their highly advanced jungle boots, Australian soldiers deliberately going barefoot remarkably maintained superior foot health. This glaring contradiction between rigid American medical doctrine and the undeniable Australian field results actively created profound cognitive dissonance among seasoned United States military medical staff. I personally saw their official casualty reports cross my desk every week, Captain Jensen vividly recalled while reviewing the seemingly impossible statistical data. According to our manuals, they should have been frantically evacuating their frontline soldiers left and right with severe rotting foot problems. But they simply were not. Their serious infection rates were drastically lower than ours across the board. Their infantrymen consistently stayed out in the hostile field significantly longer. The highly ineffective Australian military practice of conducting extended jungle barefoot operations certainly did not spontaneously originate in the humid swamps of Vietnam. It slowly evolved from 12 grueling years of brutal counterinsurgency warfare conducted during the intense Malayan emergency spanning from 1948 to 1960. During this forgotten conflict, deployed Australian forces painfully learned incredibly harsh, blood-soaked lessons about the harsh realities of asymmetric jungle warfare. These terrifying early encounters with seasoned communist guerrillas in the unforgiving rainforest would eventually fundamentally reshape their entire tactical doctrine, forcing them to completely abandon traditional Western military thinking entirely. Deep inside the dense, suffocating rainforests of Malaya, conventional Commonwealth military wisdom abruptly met harsh environmental reality and disastrously lost the initial engagements. First deployed Australian infantry units initially marched into the unforgiving jungle fully equipped with standard, heavy Commonwealth jungle boots, expecting technological superiority. However, they quickly discovered to their profound horror that this supposedly protective footwear rapidly created exactly as many debilitating medical problems as it hypothetically solved. The thick canopy trapped immense humidity, and the constant river crossings ensured that standard leather and canvas boots remained permanently soaked, creating a perfect breeding ground for aggressive bacteria. The physical friction of continuous movement in such hostile conditions quickly broke down even the most physically resilient and highly motivated combat troops. We would exhaustingly march through deep, treacherous swamps and muddy streams all day, and your heavy boots would absolutely never dry out, grimly explained Colonel David Thompson, who commanded troops with the 2nd Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, deployed in Malaya. Within mere days of deployment, you inevitably develop severe trench foot. Within a few short weeks, those festering wounds aggressively transform into massive, rotting tropical ulcers that slowly eat away at the healthy flesh. This persistent medical crisis heavily impacted operational combat effectiveness, severely degrading the unit's ability to maintain constant pressure on the elusive communist guerrillas. The frustrated medical officers were consistently pulling significantly more fighting men out of active combat patrols for entirely preventable foot problems than for actual enemy action. The tactical breakthrough ultimately came from a highly unexpected and culturally humbling source that directly challenged Western military arrogance. Desperate for a practical solution, Australian commanders began closely observing indigenous local trackers and specialized special forces veterans who had previously fought extensively alongside native IBAN and Malay jungle guides. These native auxiliary forces effortlessly moved through the extremely dense, unforgiving jungle environment with a supernatural, ghost-like silence that utterly baffled the heavily burdened Commonwealth troops. Furthermore, these local guides never seemed to suffer from the devastating, chronic foot problems that were actively plaguing the heavily booted Australian combat soldiers. The undeniable secret to their remarkable physical endurance and stealth was aggressively simple yet fundamentally contradictory to Western military logic. They consistently operated entirely barefoot or, occasionally, wearing extremely minimal, thin native sandals that allowed the foot to naturally breathe and dry immediately after crossing deep water. Adopting this radical indigenous practice required a massive psychological shift and a profound shedding of ingrained institutional military ego for the proud Australian forces. The local Malays genuinely thought we were absolute idiots, stubbornly wearing those incredibly heavy, waterlogged boots in the deep jungle. Vividly recalled Major Harry Smith, who later famously commanded D Company during the historic Battle of Long Tan. They practically showed us exactly how much faster, and significantly quieter, you could rapidly move through dense vegetation without them dragging you down. At first, our officers thought they were completely crazy. Then, out of desperation, we tried it. The Australian Army's unique institutional willingness to humbly learn from indigenous guerrilla forces and drastically adapt their core tactical doctrines stood in stark contrast to others. It actively highlighted a massive philosophical divergence from the significantly more rigid, technology-driven American military approach that heavily dominated the later Vietnam conflict. Where conventional United States forces often viewed primitive local practices with deep institutional skepticism, pragmatic Australian combat commanders actively sought out critical survival lessons. They learned directly from native fighters who had successfully survived and hunted in these extremely hostile tropical environments for countless generations without modern equipment. This remarkable cultural humility, combined with an intense focus on pragmatic battlefield flexibility, quickly became a defining, core characteristic of Australian jungle warfare doctrine. Lieutenant Colonel John Masters, a highly experienced British military officer who worked extensively alongside various Australian specialized forces in Malaya, carefully noted this profound tactical transformation. The Australians initially arrived in the theater acting as highly conventional, noisy shock troops, but they eventually left as true, silent jungle fighters, Masters recorded. They did not just superficially adapt basic tactics. They fundamentally reimagined exactly how a modern soldier must operate in that specific, unforgiving environment. Choosing to willingly go barefoot in a hostile combat zone was absolutely never about seeking personal comfort or honoring some romanticized frontier tradition. It was strictly about brutal tactical survival and maximizing pure combat effectiveness against a highly elusive, incredibly dangerous, and deeply entrenched guerrilla enemy force. By the mid-1950s, elite Australian Special Air Service squadrons were routinely conducting highly dangerous, extended reconnaissance patrols deep within the hostile Malayan jungles. During these incredibly tense missions, specialized troopers were frequently operating entirely barefoot for several consecutive days at a time, stalking their prey with lethal silence. Dedicated Australian medical officers meticulously documented the startling physiological results of these highly unconventional combat patrols with intense scientific rigor and strict objectivity. Against all conventional military medical expectations, veteran soldiers actively operating barefoot consistently showed significantly lower overall rates of debilitating fungal foot infections. Furthermore, these unburdened troops demonstrated noticeably faster cross-country movement speeds through heavy vegetation and, most critically for reconnaissance units, displayed far superior operational noise discipline. A conventional infantry soldier clomping around in standard heavy jungle boots inadvertently announced his tactical presence with every loud squelch of mud and snapping dry twig. In stark contrast, a highly trained barefoot soldier carefully navigating the same treacherous terrain moved in a state of near absolute, terrifying silence. However, achieving this level of organic stealth required an agonizing physical adaptation process that was carefully studied and heavily regulated by military training commands. Rigid Australian pre-deployment training regimens systematically began incorporating incredibly brutal barefoot marching exercises several agonizing months before a soldier ever deployed to a combat zone. The extreme physical friction and sharp pain involved in this conditioning phase effectively weeded out those lacking the immense mental fortitude required for special operations. The mandatory physical conditioning was intentionally designed to be far more punishing than the actual combat patrols, forcing the human body to adapt violently. We would have the young blokes relentlessly marching barefoot on extremely rough, jagged gravel terrain, gradually building up massive, thick, protective calluses, explained Sergeant Major Jack Williams. It was excruciatingly painful work for the new recruits joining the demanding Special Air Service Training Squadron. By the time they finally deployed overseas, the skin on the bottom of their feet was literally tough as thick leather, completely transformed from tender, weak civilian feet. This grueling, painful transformation successfully forged what the veteran Australian instructors proudly referred to as proper, indestructible jungle feet, ready for war. The highly controversial barefoot practice further expanded and became strictly codified during subsequent Australian covert military operations during the bloody Borneo confrontation from 1962. In that specific operational theater, the incredibly dense, highly mountainous primary jungle canopy made absolute tactical silence even more critical for unit survival. Australian and New Zealand specialized forces were secretly conducting highly sensitive, cross-border infiltration operations directly against aggressive Indonesian military units, probing the contested border regions. These covert Allied reconnaissance teams quickly found that relying on conventional military boots created entirely insurmountable noise discipline problems during delicate tracking operations. When setting up close-quarters lethal ambushes in the silent, suffocating rainforest, the unnatural scraping sounds of hard synthetic soles against wet roots proved deadly. You could easily hear a clumsy bloke walking in standard combat boots from over 50 meters away in the dead of night, stated Corporal Bob Kearney. If he was highly trained and moving barefoot, you might only hear him from 5 meters away, and only if he was being exceptionally careless. To actively mitigate the inherent medical risks, specialized Australian medical officers eventually developed highly specific, rigorous hygiene protocols, strictly governing these barefoot combat operations. Unlike the popular, entirely fictional Hollywood caricature of reckless soldiers simply kicking off their boots and running wild, the actual military practice was methodical. It involved incredibly careful physical preparation, mandatory daily foot inspections by unit medics, and the immediate, aggressive chemical treatment of any minor open injuries. Even the most hardened Special Forces soldiers always carried their heavy boots securely strapped inside their combat rucksacks during these long, exhausting jungle patrols. The boots were strictly reserved for rapid movement through extremely hostile, heavily booby-trapped enemy villages or when navigating exceptionally sharp, rocky, riverine terrain. They were also immediately worn whenever maintaining absolute noise discipline was no longer the primary tactical requirement for the immediate survival of the patrol. The calculated practice was entirely tactical and highly pragmatic, completely devoid of any romanticized ideological attachment to primitive native warfare or unnecessary bravado. It was absolutely never about trying to act tough or pretending to be a primitive savage, heavily emphasized Captain Bruce Davies to his doubting American counterparts. The ultimate goal was maximizing lethality while minimizing the patrol's vulnerability to sudden enemy contact in an environment where visibility was near zero. It was strictly about maximizing our core operational effectiveness, Davies continued, firmly defending the controversial military doctrine against the growing wall of American skepticism. If going completely barefoot demonstrably gave your patrol significantly better stealth, far better ground grip, and vastly superior long-term foot health, why would you not do it? The only logical reason not to was simply because some disconnected manual written by bureaucrats back in Washington explicitly said you shouldn't. By the specific time conventional Australian military forces finally deployed to the escalating Vietnam conflict in 1965, barefoot jungle operations were standard. It was a fully established, highly respected tactical option, particularly favored for deep reconnaissance missions and specialized covert forces conducting high-risk intelligence gathering. The unconventional practice was deeply documented in official Australian military training manuals, heavily supported by peer-reviewed medical field studies, and backed by years of success. Therefore, veteran Australian combat officers arriving in the Vietnamese theater were genuinely puzzled and deeply frustrated by the profound, stubborn American institutional skepticism. The Allied commanders constantly clashed over conflicting military doctrines, as the Americans heavily relied on overwhelming firepower, while the Australians favored quiet, lethal infiltration. We had literally been doing this exact type of warfare successfully for well over a bloody decade, stated Major Peter Badco, an experienced combat veteran. We actively possessed the hard empirical data. We definitely had the practical, blood-soaked combat experience. But the newly arrived Americans consistently looked at us like we were outdated, colonial relics who simply did not know any better. It was incredibly frustrating for our frontline leadership. This fundamental disagreement perfectly highlighted the upcoming tactical friction that would define the Allied military operations throughout the dense jungles of War Zone D. While the Australians were confident in their silent approach, the sheer volume of lethal punji traps and aggressive Viet Cong patrols in Vietnam presented a new challenge. The ultimate test of this barefoot doctrine would not be debated in safe briefing rooms, but proven in terrifying, close-quarters nighttime ambushes. The question remained whether the ancient silence of the jungle could truly overcome the modern, industrialized brutality of the escalating American war machine. The theoretical debates regarding Barefoot operations ultimately collided with undeniable battlefield reality during Operation Ingham in August 1966. Deep within the treacherous long high hills of Phuoc Tuy Province, a combined Allied reconnaissance force carefully tracked a highly experienced Viet Cong company. This specific enemy unit had successfully ambushed a vulnerable American logistics convoy just 2 days prior. The joint patrol consisted of elite operators from the Australian 3 Squadron Special Air Service and the heavily armed United States Special Forces A-Team 214, moving into contested territory. The profound operational differences between the two elite units immediately became glaringly apparent in the dense vegetation. The heavily equipped American operators, outfitted strictly according to doctrine with the latest issued jungle boots, moved with what they genuinely considered to be proper tactical stealth. However, the physical friction of their gear constantly betrayed them against the unyielding environment. The Australians, deliberately operating with half their element completely barefoot, moved with a fundamentally different rhythm, carefully placing their naked soles onto the damp earth to bypass brittle twigs. Sergeant First Class Daniel Martinez, a highly trained veteran of the United States 5th Special Forces Group, clearly described the specific moment his tactical perspective fundamentally shifted. He vividly recalled the intense pressure of moving through heavy, suffocating primary jungle while actively trying to close the distance on the elusive enemy unit. Despite their elite status, Martinez could frustratingly hear his own men moving. The unavoidable rustle of stiff nylon fabric, the rhythmic squeak of wet leather boots, and the metallic scrape of heavy equipment echoed loudly. For the American commandos, creating this baseline level of noise was considered an unavoidable byproduct of moving heavily armed infantry through dense brush. I simply could not help it, because that is just exactly how standard tactical movement sounds in the jungle, Martinez admitted in his debrief. Then, he closely observed the Australian scout moving just 10 feet ahead of him. The scout was entirely barefoot, navigating the exact same treacherous terrain and thick vegetation. Yet Martinez suddenly realized he could not hear the man moving at all. The barefoot operator was functioning like a complete ghost, seamlessly blending his physical movements into the natural ambient noise of the dense rainforest. This profound silence proved absolutely critical when the joint patrol finally made sudden contact near a shallow jungle stream at precisely 14:30 hours. The vigilant Viet Cong sentries, easily alerted well in advance by the rhythmic, unavoidable noise of the heavily booted American element, rapidly initiated a prepared ambush. The jungle suddenly erupted with lethal automatic weapons fire cutting through the thick green canopy. However, the enemy fighters had critically miscalculated the engagement geometry. The Viet Cong had deliberately positioned their primary firing line based entirely on where they distinctly heard the noisy Americans approaching. They completely failed to realize that the silent, barefoot Australian soldiers had already successfully flanked their concealed position entirely undetected. The enemy immediately opened up heavy fire on what they confidently thought was our main body, Martinez recalled. But 4 barefoot Aussies were already positioned directly behind their perimeter. The violent firefight was definitively over in 30 seconds. The official military after-action report presented a stark, undeniable statistical contrast regarding the engagement. The enemy suffered 14 fighters killed in action and 3 captured, while Allied casualties were strictly limited to 1 American soldier sustaining minor shrapnel wounds, with 0 Australian casualties recorded. More significantly, the immediate battlefield interrogation of the shell-shocked Viet Cong prisoners definitively revealed the fatal flaw in their defensive perimeter. They completely admitted that they had never physically detected the rapid Australian flanking movement during the chaotic build-up to the violent ambush. The terrified prisoners stated clearly that they heard the heavy American elements clumsily coming from over 100 meters away through the thick brush, reported Captain Tom Richards, the commanding Australian Special Air Service troop commander. They absolutely never heard our barefoot operators at all. For Martinez and the other seasoned American Special Forces soldiers surviving the intense patrol, this hard data was a profound tactical revelation. It directly challenged the core assumptions of their extensive training, proving that superior firepower could not replace the element of total surprise. Everything I had been rigorously taught about deep jungle operations suddenly felt incredibly incomplete and deeply flawed. Martinez honestly admitted to his superiors following the successful extraction. These Allied troops were not inherently better warfighters than us. They were certainly not physically tougher or inherently braver under heavy fire. They were simply much quieter. And in the dense jungle, quiet always wins the firefight. This specific operational advantage would reveal itself again, under far more horrifying and desperate combat circumstances, just a few brutal months later in the province. In February 1967, during the chaotic early stages of Operation Bribby, the undeniable Barefoot advantage prevented a massive military catastrophe. Delta Company of the 6th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, was conducting what was initially supposed to be a standard routine security patrol. Without warning, the isolated company suddenly encountered a massive, heavily entrenched North Vietnamese Army regular battalion, hidden in the dense foliage. The raw mathematics of the battlefield were utterly terrifying. Pitting approximately 800 heavily armed enemy combatants against a mere 108 Australians. Severely outnumbered by a horrifying ratio of 8-1, the small Australian infantry company faced the very real probability of complete annihilation within minutes. However, Delta Company possessed a unique, entirely unconventional tactical edge that standard military doctrine could never quantify. Their highly experienced lead point scout, Private Billy Watson, was operating completely barefoot at the very front of the formation. As he silently navigated the treacherous terrain, Watson managed to detect the massive enemy ambush position mere seconds before the hostile forces could successfully spring their lethal trap. Crucially, Watson did not spot the incredibly well-camouflaged enemy forces visually, nor did he hear them over the ambient jungle noise. Instead, his unprotected, highly calloused bare feet physically felt the distinct, heavy vibrations of massive troop movements transferring directly through the solid jungle floor. I physically felt it pulsing straight through the soles of my feet, Watson explicitly reported in his detailed after-action debrief. It was heavy, synchronized movement, representing far too many boots on the ground for it to be any friendly Allied forces operating in our sector. Watson immediately signaled an emergency contact warning to his right flank and rapidly moved his vulnerable element left, completely off the established jungle trail. That crucial microsecond advantage, prioritizing tactile feeling rather than auditory or visual detection, gave the desperate company just enough advanced warning. They immediately shifted their movement, narrowly avoiding the pre-planned, lethal enemy kill zone, and frantically established a hasty defensive perimeter. The subsequent, incredibly brutal 6-hour close-quarters battle was a chaotic nightmare of continuous artillery fire, desperate defensive stands, and terrifying frontal infantry assaults. The final casualty figures of the desperate engagement were staggering. The confirmed enemy toll was 105 North Vietnamese soldiers killed, while the drastically outnumbered Australians miraculously suffered only 1 combat death and 8 wounded. The Allied casualty rate would have undoubtedly been utterly catastrophic if Watson had not detected the hidden ambush fractionally earlier than conventional combat footwear would have ever allowed. Captain Barry Peterson, a seasoned United States Army military advisor permanently embedded with the Australian forces, personally witnessed the entire terrifying engagement from the perimeter. Peterson subsequently filed a highly detailed, classified intelligence report regarding the battle that widely circulated through upper-level United States military intelligence channels. He objectively noted that the Australian scouts' bare feet directly provided a massive sensory advantage that standard American operating procedures completely failed to account for. The organic ability to physically feel distinct ground vibrations provided crucial early warning that both visual and auditory detection completely missed, Peterson wrote. This is not merely anecdotal evidence. This is a highly reproducible, critical tactical advantage that actively saves combat lives. The turning point from deep institutional skepticism to serious scientific inquiry finally arrived in May 1967. Captain Robert Jensen systematically compiled 6 grueling months of medical evacuation data directly comparing Allied forces operating in similar, unforgiving terrain. The cold, empirical statistics documented in his comprehensive medical report were completely impossible for the rigid American military establishment to ignore. Foot-related medical evacuations for conventional American troops stood at a staggering 1,047 per 10,000 deployed soldiers. In stark contrast, the Barefoot Australian infantry units recorded only 392 evacuations per 10,000 men. Debilitating tropical foot infections requiring prolonged hospitalization severely affected 23% of American frontline personnel, compared to a mere 8% for the Australians. The average duration a specialized soldier remained entirely out of combat action due to aggressive fungal problems was 19 days for heavily booted Americans. For the Barefoot Australians, the recovery period averaged only 7 days. Furthermore, 91% of injured Australian soldiers successfully returned to full combat duty, while only 64% of affected American infantrymen ever managed to fully recover and return to their respective frontline combat units. These dramatic numbers simply do not make any logical sense according to everything I was rigorously taught, Jensen wrote in his official report to the Surgeon General of the United States Army Medical Corps. Soldiers operating without standard protective boots in a highly hostile tropical environment should logically experience significantly higher injury and severe infection rates, not lower. But the gathered medical data is entirely unambiguous and statistically sound. Whatever these pragmatic Australians are actively doing out there in the bush, it is definitively working far better than our rigidly established standard operating protocols. The groundbreaking report heavily featured direct testimonials from exhausted United States field medics who routinely treated severe Australian combat casualties. Specialist David Chen, a highly experienced combat medic serving with the 9th Medical Battalion, provided a stark observation regarding the Allied troops. We would constantly get these tough Aussie soldiers coming into the triage tent with severe gunshot wounds, brutal shrapnel injuries, and typical horrific combat trauma, Chen explained. But remarkably, their calloused bare feet were completely fine and healthy. Meanwhile, we were frantically treating our own American soldiers by the absolute hundreds for rotting immersion foot. The most devastating psychological blow to the American medical doctrine was not the raw statistics, but the undeniable photographic evidence. Jensen's controversial report included glaring side-by-side comparative photographs of infantrymen's feet documented immediately after extended, grueling jungle combat patrols. The American soldiers visibly displayed expected severe moisture damage, heavily macerated white skin, aggressive fungal growth, and early-stage trench foot featuring deep separating lesions. Conversely, the Australian soldiers actively operating barefoot showcased heavily calloused, deeply tanned, but fundamentally healthy feet presenting absolutely minimal infection and zero signs of debilitating water immersion tissue damage. Following the widespread circulation of Jensen's undeniable medical report, several elite United States Special Forces teams immediately requested official permission to experiment. By July 1967, elements within the 3rd Corps initiated highly classified trials incorporating selective barefoot operations during extended reconnaissance patrols. Staff Sergeant Michael Torres, an experienced operator leading A-Team 335, eagerly volunteered his entire elite squad for a rigorous, strictly controlled combat trial. They systematically alternated deep jungle patrols, wearing standard boots and going completely barefoot, meticulously documenting ambient noise levels, overall foot health, and pure operational combat effectiveness against the enemy. The transition was physically brutal and psychologically terrifying for the American commandos accustomed to thick leather protection. That absolute first barefoot combat patrol was weird as hell and incredibly stressful. Torres openly admitted in his classified debrief, "I felt completely vulnerable and terrifyingly exposed. Every single sharp stick, jagged rock, and unseen thorn felt like it might instantly kill you or sever a tendon. But after about an agonizing hour of slow movement, something profound fundamentally changed within my brain. Your sensitive bare feet actively started reading the complex terrain, providing vital sensory intelligence. Torres explained that his operators could physically feel minute changes in ground composition, instantly sensing hidden depressions where enemies might have dug concealed spider holes. The tactical results from their 8 grueling combat patrols over 6 weeks were eventually documented in classified after-action reports, declassified only decades later. The average detection distance by hostile enemy forces when the team wore standard boots was measured at 73 meters. When operating completely barefoot, that critical detection range dramatically shrank to a mere 18 meters, drastically increasing the operational survivability of the small, vulnerable reconnaissance team. However, this immense tactical advantage demanded an incredibly steep and often bloody physical price from the operators involved. The Australian tactical method was absolutely not without horrific casualties and permanent physical trauma. Between 1966 and 1971, comprehensive Australian military medical records explicitly documented 47 highly significant foot injuries directly attributable to specialized barefoot operations. These horrifying battlefield casualties included deep, septic lacerations from concealed punji stakes, highly venomous snake bites, massive aggressive bacterial infections stemming from untreated minor jungle wounds, and severe, tendon-severing lacerations caused by razor-sharp bamboo stakes hidden in the dense mud. We definitively lost good fighting men to the brutal practice, solemnly acknowledged Major Bruce Davies, the chief medical officer overseeing Australian forces operating in Phuoc Tui. It was not a massive number, relatively speaking, compared to gunfire, but absolutely every single combat casualty stemming from a technically preventable cause heavily weighs on your conscience. You constantly ask yourself during triage, would standard combat boots have saved this bleeding man's foot? Sometimes the honest, painful answer was absolutely yes. But the tactical reality of war required accepting that brutal risk to ensure the patrol's overall survival. The battlefield was a constantly evolving, ruthless ecosystem, where neither side held a permanent tactical advantage for very long. The seasoned North Vietnamese army and the highly adaptive Viet Cong quickly faced their own survival challenges upon encountering these increasingly stealthy Allied operators. In direct response to the silent barefoot patrols, aggressive Viet Cong guerrilla units rapidly increased their widespread deployment of horrific punji stake traps. They deliberately coated these sharpened bamboo spikes in lethal toxins and human excrement, specifically designing the concealed ground obstacles to severely maim unprotected barefoot soldiers attempting to silently flank their fortified positions. They absolutely knew we were coming at them barefoot, grimly recalled Corporal Jack Henderson of the elite New Zealand Special Air Service. So they would deliberately cover entire tactical choke points in those bloody, poisoned punji traps to intentionally maim us. It drastically slowed our operational tempo down because every single footstep had to be incredibly carefully placed in the mud. Furthermore, the highly disciplined North Vietnamese regulars actively adapted their own counter-tactics, drafting dedicated training manuals that heavily emphasized even quieter movement protocols for their own troops wearing simple tire rubber sandals, ensuring a lethal, silent arms race. The period from late 1968 through 1970 firmly represented the absolute peak of Australian barefoot reconnaissance effectiveness in the Vietnam conflict. During the grueling Operation Coburg, specialized Australian units conducting silent barefoot operations achieved what remains a historically lopsided combat ratio. They recorded 1 friendly casualty to 37 confirmed North Vietnamese army kills during 3 weeks of continuous jungle operations. The grim statistics highlighted a stark operational contrast, proving that their unconventional methods generated highly measurable, lethal results against a heavily armed, highly disciplined, conventional enemy force navigating their own home terrain. We basically owned that suffocating jungle at night, vividly recalled Sergeant Major Bob Kearney of 3 Squadron. The enemy regulars could easily hear massive American infantry units clumsily moving from kilometers away, but they absolutely never heard our specialized teams at all. The raw data from this brutal period definitively supported his bold assertion. The average enemy detection range of Australian barefoot patrols was a terrifyingly close 15 meters. In stark contrast, standard United States patrols were routinely detected from over 80 meters away, completely sacrificing the critical element of tactical surprise before engagements even began. This profound sensory advantage directly translated into an incredible 94% reconnaissance success rate for the Australians, meaning patrols repeatedly extracted without ever being fatally compromised. Meanwhile, heavily equipped American long-range patrols struggled with a 67% success rate in similar terrain. Consequently, the Australian task force operating in Phuoc Tuy province, utilizing a relatively small peak strength of merely 8,000 personnel, consistently achieved broader tactical results entirely comparable to American operations involving forces 10 times larger. Their unique ability to traverse the jungle completely undetected ultimately proved to be a massive, undeniable force multiplier. The undeniable tactical success of these Australian methods inevitably created entirely unexpected political complications back in the United States. By late 1969, as general American public support for the grinding war rapidly eroded and domestic combat casualties tragically mounted, frustrated media outlets began weaponizing these Allied statistics. One highly controversial Time magazine headline bluntly stated that the Allied Australians fought much smarter and died significantly less. The accompanying article detailed their specific Barefoot operations, using these gritty tactical innovations as implicit, devastating criticism against standard American military leadership and their heavy reliance on overwhelming firepower. The senior military leadership in Washington suddenly found themselves cornered in an incredibly awkward bureaucratic position regarding these revelations. Openly acknowledging Australian tactical superiority directly implied that American forces were systematically poorly trained or stubbornly led into ambushes. Conversely, dismissing these effective foreign methods required desperately explaining why a much smaller Allied contingent consistently achieved vastly superior survival results. The official institutional response was cowardly bureaucratic silence. "We tragically became a toxic political football for both sides," bitterly recalled Brigadier Stuart Graham, the frustrated commander of the highly effective 1st Australian Task Force in Vietnam. The domestic anti-war movement constantly cited our specific survival tactics as absolute proof that the Americans were conducting warfare incorrectly, Graham further explained. Meanwhile, the defensive pro-war side stubbornly argued we simply possessed completely different mission parameters and faced weaker enemies, which was a lie. Everyone desperately wanted to manipulate our combat data to make a loud political point about America's failing war. We were honestly just trying to do our brutal jobs efficiently and somehow get our exhausted soldiers home alive. The strategic impact of this debate fundamentally challenged rigid American warfare assumptions forever. The hard-earned lessons from these bloody Australian Barefoot operations slowly influenced United States military doctrine in incredibly subtle but highly significant ways. The officially revised 1973 edition of Field Manual 3120, covering Special Forces operational techniques, quietly included unprecedented changes. It featured a completely new section, carefully detailing selective reduced equipment operations for reconnaissance elements. This specific institutional edition obliquely referenced the highly successful Australian infiltration methods without ever explicitly endorsing the controversial Barefoot tactics, stubbornly avoiding a direct admission that their previous rigid footwear doctrine had actively cost countless American lives. The manual finally acknowledged that in very specific tactical situations, utilizing minimum equipment and maintaining absolute noise discipline provided massive advantages. These stealth benefits could actively offset the additional physical risks assumed by the individual operator navigating hostile terrain. Furthermore, adapted Australian physical training protocols were carefully incorporated into the United States Ranger School curriculum during the late 1970s. They were not taught as standard operating procedure, but rather as a profound physical demonstration. It proved that unconventional, deeply uncomfortable approaches sometimes produce vastly better battlefield results than rigidly following conventional military wisdom. We were absolutely not teaching young Rangers to permanently operate barefoot in combat, firmly explained a veteran Ranger School instructor reflecting on the era. We were aggressively teaching them to constantly question flawed institutional assumptions and strictly adapt to their immediate circumstances rather than blindly following outdated doctrine. The real lesson transcended footwear entirely. The fundamental lesson was simply about basic cultural humility, reflected Colonel David Hackworth, a highly decorated American combat officer. The pragmatic Australians were always willing to learn from native locals and completely abandon their own conventional military wisdom to survive. They were perfectly willing to look entirely ridiculous to staff officers if it meant being significantly more lethal in the field, Hackworth continued. When American forces were finally willing to do that, we were highly effective. When we rigidly refused, we bled. This profound tactical respect was deeply shared by the very enemy they hunted. We eventually learned to absolutely fear the ghostly soldiers who intentionally made no sound, quietly recalled Nguyen Van Tran, a scarred former North Vietnamese army sergeant who had desperately fought against the Australian Specialized Forces in Phuoc Tuy province. Decades of intense post-war medical analysis conclusively vindicated the controversial Australian field protocols regarding tropical foot health. The comprehensive data proved that Allied forces operating strategically in dense jungle environments experienced dramatically lower long-term rates of chronic, debilitating foot problems. They also documented significantly faster healing recovery times from minor puncture injuries and drastically fewer total combat days lost to entirely preventable bacterial conditions. The massive American financial investment in highly advanced, ventilated jungle boots, while fundamentally well-intentioned by military planners, had ironically created a lethal equipment dependency that actively worked against the soldiers' best interests. This glaring contradiction left a permanent, heavy psychological scar on the exhausted American medical personnel who served there. The military doctors and field triage nurses had been aggressively conditioned to completely trust their advanced equipment and standardized treatments over raw environmental adaptation. Realizing that the rigid adherence to these modern safety regulations had directly caused thousands of unnecessary casualties was a deeply bitter pill to swallow. They were forced to reconcile the painful truth that their protective gear was actively rotting the flesh of the very combat infantrymen it was specifically designed to save. The controversial barefoot practice directly influenced the fundamental evolution of global special operations doctrine for decades following the war. Elite units worldwide, including the British Special Air Service and specialized forces from Indonesia, Thailand, and Malaysia, carefully studied the data. They subsequently incorporated selective barefoot tracking and silent reconnaissance techniques into their advanced jungle warfare training curriculums. They did not adopt it as a permanent, standard operating procedure for all infantry deployments, but rather as an essential, highly available tactical option specifically reserved for when extreme environmental circumstances demanded absolute stealth over physical protection. Perhaps most significantly, the pragmatic Australian approach aggressively challenged the entrenched Western military cultures that blindly prioritized massive standardization over local tactical adaptation. Modern elite special operations forces heavily emphasize supreme cognitive flexibility, deep cultural learning, and a profound willingness to immediately adopt highly unconventional methods. These are the exact core operational principles that those tough Australian reconnaissance forces perfectly demonstrated in the bloody jungles of Vietnam. They achieved this profound tactical superiority through something as incredibly simple and seemingly primitive as intentionally taking off their heavy combat boots before a long patrol. You could easily prepare defensive ambushes for the conventional Americans because you could always hear them clumsily tracking through the brush, Tran admitted. But the barefoot Australians literally appeared out of the thick shadows like vengeful spirits. By the terrifying time you finally realized they were standing there, you were already bleeding inside their lethal kill zone. In the tragic end, it was never simply a rigid debate about bare feet versus heavy combat boots. It was fundamentally about surviving the brutal friction of war, as Lieutenant General Frank Bryman later solemnly reflected upon his respective command. It was strictly about humbly asking what the unforgiving environment violently demanded, rather than arrogantly imposing what a printed doctrine prescribed, Bryman concluded. Captain Mike Walsh, the shocked medical officer who initially witnessed that barefoot trooper, eventually submitted a formal request recommending these precise Australian protocols. He finally understood that technological superiority cannot ever replace pure tactical flexibility. The dense, neutral jungle ultimately does not care about advanced equipment, political posturing, or thick training manuals. It coldly and exclusively rewards those who understand it deeply enough to silently move through its shadows like ghosts.